on yet another semi-annual attic purge that never actually gets finished. I was sorting through an old box of papers, and in it I found a manila file folder marked Important Papers, along with the usual stuff like concert ticket stubs, a receipt for the first audio amplifier I ever bought, and other miscellaneous random bits from my childhood. I found this page that I had torn out of a magazine and saved, probably when I was around 15 or 16 years old. I had completely forgotten that I had this picture, but as soon as I saw it, I remembered back to when I was a kid and why I kept it. I really wanted to build it someday. There was something about this simple little table that resonated with my 15-year-old brain. Even now, as an adult, the design still appeals to me, although I could do without the hideous 80s pastel decor and the brass hardware. The construction would have been far beyond my abilities or tooling at the time, so I decided that I would pay homage to my childhood wish and build my version of this table. I started out with sticks of 7/8 inch thick, soft curly maple that I glued together to form square leg blanks. I also rough cut the leg taper and the capitals on the bandsaw, and at the same time I cut a router jig that I could use to finalize the leg shape later. I also had some really clear curly maple planks that I would use to form the front, back, and side aprons of this little table. Maybe, 15 years ago, there was a flurry of activity around sawyers going out to the original redwood stands in California and harvesting material from old-growth stumps that were left behind by the logging industry, sometimes that had been sitting there for hundreds of years or more. This plank came from one of those harvesting trips, cut from an old, discarded stump of redwood near the base of the tree. From a much larger slab that had cracks, bark inclusions, dry rot, insect damage, and other problems, I managed to salvage this piece, around 4 foot long and 15 inches deep and just a little over an inch thick. It has really pretty swirling grain, sometimes called a flame pattern. To finalize the leg shape, I used a tall pattern bit on my router table. The lower guide bearing will ride against the template that I cut earlier, and the bit will ensure that I have clean cuts and uniformly shaped legs. In my opinion, the easiest way to attach a template to the workpiece is by using poster tape. It's very thin. It doesn't have any smush to it, so your piece doesn't shift around after it's been taped. It holds very tightly, but it's super easy to peel off the workpiece when you're done. Each leg got a pass through the router, with the template rotated after each side was finished to form the curved capitals. As you can see, the poster tape comes off easily and cleanly whenever you're done with it. I really love working with curly maple, but even exercising considerable care, you will get some tear out. I went over each leg with a cabinet scraper to iron out the small ridges and fix any areas where the fibers had been torn. This also allowed me to refine the curved shape at the top of each leg. I would join the legs to the aprons with standard mortise and tenon joints. So I laid out the locations on each leg in preparation for getting those cut. In hindsight, I should have cut the mortises before milling the legs. As it was, I had to shim the tapered side of each leg so that the mortises would be cut perpendicular. That represented some additional hassle that I didn't really need. I took a couple of test passes to get my depth stop set correctly. Once everything lined up as expected, then I could plunge all 8 mortises. Next up, I cut the apron front, sides, and back to rough length. The apron tenons were shaped at the table saw with a dado stack. I could then rip all 4 pieces to their final height. Here's a quick look at all the completed parts ready for final fitting. The wobble dado stack that I have leaves a somewhat less than desirable finish and certainly not adequate for glue ups. So I went ahead and did a cleanup on all the shoulders of these tenons and get them ready for final assembly. Using the router template, I also went ahead and cut some clamping blocks that I would use later. It was at this point that I realized I had made a mistake in cutting the mortises. They were too long. When I later cut the legs to their final length, I would be left with very little material supporting the top of the mortise, and they would be far too weak. Fortunately for me, this would be fairly easy to fix. I just needed to get some stock cut down to the right thickness and then glue a little plug in at the top of each mortise to fill in the extra space. Once the glue had dried, I could simply cut off the excess and plane it flat. Next, I could size the tenons to the mortises by marking the locations that they needed to be cut. And here's one last shot of all the various parts, pieces, cut, fitted, stapled, spindled, mutilated, ready to roll. In the interest of relieving stress during glue up, I went ahead and did a dry fit of everything just to make sure pieces went together as expected. I did have a couple of items that I needed to make minor tweaks to, but otherwise everything came together pretty well. The last step for me was to get each of the legs cut to their final length, so I pulled everything back apart, went over to the miter saw, and trimmed everything to length. You can really see here that if I hadn't put those mortise plugs in, the top of these legs would have been far too weak. The glue up went off without a hitch. I got everything in clamps and left it overnight to dry. on to my favorite part of any woodworking project, sanding, sanding, sanding. I started off at 150, sanded through to 220, and then knocked off all of the sharp edges around the piece with some hand sanding. Here's what the table base looks like completely sanded and ready for finish. The finish for this table will be a multi-step process, but first stop is a coat of tung oil. I specifically wanted to use tung oil that had a UV inhibitor built into it. Maple tends to get kind of an amber yellow color as it ages, and I wanted to try to preserve the natural maple color for as long as possible. Tung oil is super easy to apply. Just put it on a rag and flood the surface. Here's what the base is looking like after the first coat of tung oil. I let it sit for about 20 minutes and then wiped off the excess. The tung oil really makes that curly figure in the maple pop, and as you look down the table you can really see that three-dimensional shimmering. I let everything dry overnight and then hit all surfaces with a light sanding with 320 grit paper. The tabletop received the same treatment as the base. Sanded with 150 up to 220, knocked off the edges, and then it's on to a coat of tung oil. That color that you see showing there on the redwood, that is the actual wood color. The tung oil that I'm using is clear. It has no coloring in it at all. So this is the actual color of the wood. As you can probably see there as I'm putting the tung oil on, the wood is just wicking it in at a really fast clip. The wood is so dry and has been drying for so long that it's just absorbing the finish like a sponge. As that finish goes on, you can really see that flame pattern in the redwood's figure come up. just really beautiful stuff. I ended up going back over the surface several times with additional finish, and each time the wood just continued to suck that finish down in. So rather than trying to do that in multiple coats over multiple days, I just decided to stand there, keep the rag completely flooded with finish, and just go over the surface over and over and over again until I could see that it wasn't immediately becoming dry. If you've ever worked with tung oil, it takes a long time to dry, and I think it was made worse in this situation because of how much finish ended up on the piece. So these shots are after 6 days had elapsed. There was 3 days or so of dry time per coat, but this is after 2 coats of tung oil. I then sealed the surfaces with 2 light coats of dewaxed shellac with, a light sanding in between each one. The final finish for the top was oil-based polyurethane that I thinned about 20% with mineral spirits to make it a wiping poly. The top got 6 coats of this with a light sanding in between each coat, and of course it took 12 to 24 hours for each coat to dry, so this process got spread out over nearly a full week. The base got essentially the same treatment as the top, although there were fewer coats of finish. I ended up with 2 coats of sanding sealer and then 2 coats of oil poly, again applied with some light sanding between each coat. And here we are, all done. Here are the requisite furniture porn shots. I think it turned out really pretty.